The day I moved into what I thought was my dream neighborhood, I never expected the HOA to treat me like an intruder. Within hours, they weren't just sending warnings, they were calling the police. Imagine stepping out of your own home and seeing flashing lights, not because you broke the law, but because your new neighbors decided you didn't belong. That was just the beginning of a nightmare fueled by petty rules, power-hungry board members, and one neighbor who would stop at nothing to push me out. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't the type to back down. So how far do you think an HOA will go before their own power games come crashing down? When my wife Emily and I first bought our house, we thought we had finally arrived. After years of saving, years of renting cramped apartments, we had found a place that felt like home. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. 2 stories with a white fence, a tidy little yard, and enough space for us to start thinking about the future we always talked about. The neighborhood seemed perfect. The streets were quiet, lined with neat driveways and manicured lawns. Kids played in cul-de-sacs without fear, and families gathered on weekends to grill outside. There was a sense of community in the air, the kind we both longed for. We pictured summer evenings on the porch, planting flowers in the garden and slowly becoming part of this world. The Homeowners Association, the HOA, barely crossed my mind when we signed the papers. To me, it was just background noise. Everyone said it was standard in neighborhoods like this, a group that handled common spaces, organized seasonal events, and kept the place looking good. At most, I thought it meant replacing a street light when it went out or sending out newsletters about block parties. On our first day, as Emily planted roses by the porch, I saw Karen for the first time. She lived directly across from us, a woman in her late 50s with sharp features and a carefully styled blonde bob. She wore a pastel cardigan and pearls, even while watering her plants. She didn't wave. She just stood there, arms crossed, eyes fixed on us like we were intruders on her personal territory. I laughed it off, telling Emily she was probably just curious about the new neighbors. But even as the sun set, I caught her staring from her window. Curtain slightly pulled back, as if every move we made was already under her scrutiny. At that moment, I didn't realize it, but Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed guardian of this community, and she had already decided we didn't belong. The first letter came 2 days later. A crisp white envelope tucked neatly into our mailbox, stamped with the HOA seal. Inside was a polite but firm notice. Our roses were non-compliant with community standards. Apparently, the board had strict rules about the type, color, and arrangement of flowers permitted in front yards. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Who cared what flowers we planted? Emily had picked them because they reminded her of her grandmother's garden, a personal touch that made our house feel like home. I crumpled the letter and tossed it aside, convinced it wasn't worth worrying about. 2 days later, another letter arrived, this time about my car. According to the HOA, I had parked at an angle inconsistent with community guidelines. The violation carried a $100 fine, with a warning that it would double if unpaid. That was the moment I realized this wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone was watching us, documenting our every move, and I didn't have to guess who. It was Karen. It didn't stop there. When Emily hung wind chimes on the porch, we received a notice claiming they were noise pollutants. When I left the garbage can out for an extra hour, another fine appeared. When I coiled a hose by the garage, I was told it was improper storage. Every week, without fail, there was a new violation, a new demand for money. It felt like living under surveillance. Every time I walked outside, I caught Karen at her window, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The rules weren't about keeping up appearances, they were weapons. And Karen wielded them mercilessly. I decided to attend an HOA board meeting, thinking reason might prevail. I stood in front of them, 5 people in business casual, seated at a long table, shuffling papers and sipping coffee as if my life was an inconvenience. I explained the situation, pointed out how ridiculous the violations were, and asked for leniency. Karen leaned forward, smiling just enough to show she enjoyed every second of it. When the board announced their decision, I knew the outcome before they even spoke. All fines upheld. No appeals. No compromise. Walking out of that room, I felt a deep, simmering rage. This wasn't about rules. It was about power. They wanted us to submit, to bend until we broke. But I wasn't ready to break. The harassment escalated further. A violation notice was taped to our front door, bold letters for all our neighbors to see. Emily's car tires were slashed one night. Never proven, but the timing too perfect to be coincidence. The HOA denied involvement, of course, but when I demanded they investigate, they shrugged it off. And then came the tipping point. One morning, I found a wooden stake planted in our yard with a foreclosure notice stapled to it. According to the HOA, unpaid dues and escalating penalties had accumulated to the point where they were initiating proceedings to seize our home, the one we worked years to afford. I stood in the yard gripping that notice, the weight of it crushing me. Emily stood beside me, tears welling in her eyes, asking how this could even be legal. And for the first time, I wondered if Karen might actually succeed in driving us out. But fear has a way of hardening into resolve. I refused to let them win. I started digging. Every night after work, I pored over HOA bylaws, old newsletters, county property codes, anything I could get my hands on. I compared rules, highlighted contradictions, noted loopholes. Slowly, a picture emerged. The HOA thrived not on legality, but on intimidation. They counted on homeowners being too scared or too tired to fight back. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was furious, and when I finally found the one clause buried deep in their own bylaws, the one that could unravel their entire scheme, I knew the battle was about to reach its peak. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread about our foreclosure notice, and neighbors who normally stayed silent filled the chairs, whispering, curious to see what would happen. I walked in with Emily by my side and a thick folder of documents under my arm. Karen sat at the head of the table, smug as ever, surrounded by her loyal board. She looked at me like she had already won, but this time, I wasn't here to beg. I was here to fight. When it was my turn to speak, I laid it all out. Every violation notice, every contradictory rule, every instance where the HOA had bent its own laws to target us. I read aloud the clause I had found, one that explicitly prohibited the board from levying fines or threatening foreclosure without a unanimous vote and documented evidence. Then I revealed the emails. Anonymous neighbors had slipped me copies, emails where Karen instructed the board to make an example out of us, to bury them in fines until they leave. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face turned crimson. She tried to object, tried to wave it off as a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. Her words were there in black and white. The board shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were implicated too. Neighbors began to murmur, voices growing louder, demanding answers. Someone shouted that Karen should step down. Another demanded the board resign. I stood there calm as the room erupted. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. For the first time, she was the one on the defensive. That night, the balance of power shifted. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. The board launched an internal review, mostly to save themselves, but the conclusion was inevitable. Karen was stripped of her position. Without her, the board crumbled and several members resigned under pressure. The foreclosure notice was rescinded. Every fine we had been issued was voided, and the stack of papers that once represented intimidation now stood as proof of victory. But the most satisfying part wasn't the paperwork. It was the silence. Karen's window blinds stayed closed. Her arms were no longer folded across her chest as she glared at us. She became a ghost in the neighborhood she once ruled, avoided by the very people who had once feared her. Slowly, the community began to heal. Neighbors who had stayed quiet started stopping by, offering congratulations, sharing their own stories of being bullied by the HOA. What once felt like an oppressive, hostile street now began to feel like the community Emily and I had dreamed of when we first moved in. One afternoon, as Emily replanted her roses in the front yard, several neighbors came over to help. Laughter and conversation filled the air where silence and suspicion once lingered. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like home. Looking back, I realized this fight had been about more than just flowers or cars or fines. It was about standing up to abuse of power, about refusing to be intimidated into silence. The HOA counted on fear, but we showed them what happens when someone refuses to back down. And as I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I couldn't help but wonder, how many other neighborhoods are living under the same kind of tyranny, waiting for someone to say, "Enough is enough"? Because in the end, the lesson was clear. Sometimes the only way to protect your home is to fight for it. And sometimes fighting back is the only way to truly belong.